Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to Venture Wisdom. This is the place we talk all things venture capital and private equity. I'm your host, Rakesh, as you know. Today, another interesting topic, another interesting day. We are talking about waterfalls in venture capital. And to discuss that and share the wisdom, we have Yoni joining us again. Those who have not heard Yoni earlier, Yoni is a star fund expert and lawyer based out of LA, and he's a partner with DLA Piper, a lawyer for 20 years, and does all things venture capital. And if you have already not heard any of his previous conversations on venture wisdom, I suggest you go and do that. It will be a great primer and knowledge for you all. So welcome again, Yoni. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being with us.
Rakesh, great to be on with you again. I'm excited today in particular because we have a real special conversation.
Yeah, I believe everybody looks forward to that flow of money. Ultimately, that's what the whole business boils down to. And as the topic says, waterfall, and the word literally translates into the flow of money. And looking forward to what it is. If you would quickly start with what is the importance of waterfall and what it means both for the GPs and LPs as well as for the fund managers for that matter, and then we can jump into the depth of the subject.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. When I talk through with a client terms of a new fund they're forming, and we talk through all the important stuff, the fundraising period and the investment period and the term and the key person provisions and the management fees and the restricted and the investment limitations and the drawdowns, and we talk through everything. But when I get to this conversation, I say, this is why we're here. Like, it's the distributions. That's why we're all here, right? So the fund calls down cash, makes investments. The investments do well. Sometimes not all of them do well, right? How does the cash go out? How does the fund share the cash from investments between the investors and the general partner? That's what we're going to talk about.
Looking forward to it. I think this is the most exciting topic for anybody who's involved in the venture business, and can't wait what you have for us to learn from your knowledge and expertise today.
It is the most exciting, and it's also the hardest. When I was a first year associate, we would represent investors, big pension funds investing into funds all the time. And this is not my current firm, it's another firm, doesn't exist anymore. The corporate lawyers wouldn't even review the distribution waterfall. Who reviewed it? The tax guys. Why? Because the tax guys are always the smartest guys, right? And they know numbers, and they could crunch numbers, and they know spreadsheets. So that was wrong, in my opinion. Funds lawyers, if you don't know how to manipulate, negotiate waterfalls, then you're in the wrong business. It shouldn't be a tax thing for sure. But I say that as kind of an anecdote to just show you how a lot of people can get it wrong, right? So I want to share with you a slide. I actually made this just for you, Rakesh, just for today.
Thank you.
First time rolling this out, but I think it's really good. It's going to illustrate a few really important things. Okay, perfect. Let's talk about waterfalls, distribution waterfalls. There are 3 types, okay? Don't forget the 3 types of waterfalls. Now, there are more than 3, but these are the big 3, right? These are the 3 categories of waterfalls. Let's get our language down. There's a European waterfall. That's the most LP friendly.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's an American waterfall. There's European and American. So that's 2. Didn't I say there's 3? Yes. Because there are 2 types of American waterfalls. There's what I call the classic American waterfall and what I call the modified American waterfall. So we have the European waterfall, which is the most investor friendly, and we'll see why and how. Then we have on the other side of the spectrum, the most GP friendly, the classic American waterfall. And then we have a version of the American waterfall that moves that GP friendly waterfall a little bit more LP friendly than the classic version of the American waterfall. So that's what I call like the in-between version, the
Would you
modified
call it a
American
hybrid
waterfall.
waterfall or the modified
I would
waterfall?
just call it a modified American. It's not a European waterfall. It's clearly an American waterfall, but there's a feature to it that makes it a bit more friendly to investors than its classic cousin.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between these three waterfalls? Okay. The difference is in the first step of the waterfall. When you get past the first step, they're all the same. The differences between these three waterfalls lies in the very first step. And here's a question for you. You have a pot of money to distribute between yourself as a general partner and your investors. How much of your investors' capital contributions that they've already made to your fund must you return in that very first step? The answer to that question
Would be
tells you
contribution?
everything between these different waterfalls. So let's take an example. But before we take an example, I want to make one point of clarification. I said there's three types of waterfalls: European, Classic American, and Modified American. So an astute listener will say, but wait a second, some waterfalls have a preferred return and some don't. And if there is a preferred return, some waterfalls have a catch-up and some don't. And if there is a preferred return and a catch-up, some waterfalls have 100% catch-up. Some have a 50-50 catch-up. Some have an 80-20 catch-up. So aren't there a lot of types of waterfalls? And so I just want to just make very clear in the beginning of this conversation that yes, there are all these different ways to build waterfalls. But all of those things that I just described, is there a preferred return? Is there a catch-up? What's the preferred return? Is it compounding? Is it simple? Is the catch-up rate 100%, something lower than 100%? Where in the waterfall do all of those differences lie? They all lie in steps 2 and 3.
Mm-hmm.
None of those touch step 1. The core difference of what the waterfalls may look like are these 3 ideas that hit step 1. And then after step 1, and this will become very clear as we talk more, after step 1 of the waterfall, true, you could make a lot more differences in steps 2, 3, and 4. Preferred returns, catch-ups, premium carry above certain higher return thresholds for investors, where instead of the GP getting 20% of the carry, it's now getting 30% of the carry. All those things are true, but those are nuances. Those are not fundamental differences among waterfall types. Okay?
They are just the variances in the numbers that are used in there.
Yes, and they could have big impacts on the returns, right, to the GP and the investors.
Which is
But
fair.
ultimately,
But the
100%.
framework does not change.
The framework doesn't change, right? And so we talk about 3 waterfall types, which again, we're just using these terms and it will become clear. But when we talk about a European waterfall versus a classic American versus a modified American, any of those 3 can have a preferred return or may not have a preferred return. If there is a preferred return, any one of those 3 may have a catch-up for the GP or may not. If there is a catch-up, it could be at a quicker rate or a slower rate to catch up. There could be an 80-20 split in the carry at the last step of the waterfall, or there may be premium carries granted to the GP above certain return hurdles to investors. All of those differences are true or can be true with respect to all 3 of these paradigms of the waterfall. But at the root, these 3 paradigms are what changes one waterfall to the other. And then you could add on like Lego blocks to your American waterfall, a preferred return and a catch-up and a premium carry. So, just as you could do the same with your European waterfall or your classic or modified American. Let's go through some numbers and this will become very clear. But before we do, big picture, what's the difference between these 3 waterfalls? European is the most LP friendly. Why? Because in the first step of the waterfall, it requires a general partner to return every single dollar that was called from the investor. Now, why do I call capital from an investor? For a number of reasons. I call capital from an investor to make an investment. That investment may have been disposed of. Ultimately, it was sold. It may have been written off. It may be held at cost or held at a markup. I call capital for management fees. I call capital for other fund expenses, legal bills, lawsuits, fund audit, admin, tax, filings, everything. So there's a universe of reasons why I call capital. But breaking it down, big picture, it's for investments and for expenses. Expenses includes a management fee. Investments can be broken up into three categories. Investments that have been disposed of, investments that have been written off, and investments that are chugging along, whether at cost, below cost, the markup. In a European waterfall, the first step of the waterfall requires the GP to return every single dollar that it called from those investors for all those different reasons that I listed out on this hand, for deals that have been disposed of, for deals that have been written off, for deals that are being held at cost or at a markdown or at a markup, for management fees, for other fund expenses. All of those dollars need to be returned.
Any contribution made has to go first.
Every contribution that's been called, that's been made by the LP, needs to be returned in the first step of the waterfall. That's what makes it the most LP friendly.
Nothing for the GP, even if they have made any contribution from their end.
I'm glad you asked. No, I would not agree with that. If a GP makes a capital contribution, like in a typical fund, let's say your typical first-time venture fund, very often the GP will make $1 contribution for every $99 that the investor makes. Typically, the GP has 1% of skin in the game. Mm-hmm. The GP's cash is treated the same as the LP's. The GP's cash does not sit behind the LP's cash. So as there are distributions to be made by the fund, the LP will have 99% of the distribution in its account, and the GP will have 1%. That's true. The GP's 1% does not wait for the LP to get their 99%, and then the GP can get its 1%.
But the 20%
those are pari passu. Exactly. It's the 20%. It's the profits interest. It's the share of the upside of the fund's productivity, a profit, that's paid from the account of the limited partner, of the investor, to the account of the general partner. That's what sits behind the LP's return. But the GP's own cash that it contributed and the returns of and on that dollars that the GP distributed, that does not sit behind the investors. Okay?
Yep.
So we'll have one investor in the fund, okay? And the investor contributed $600. The investor contributed $600 to a fund. Let's look at the slide. Let's look at that top left quadrant over here. This is the one example we'll talk about. There were 3 deals, deal number 1, deal number 2, and deal number 3. And before I go on, I need to do a shout out to Connor Maldo, my associate here in LA, who put this together for me yesterday. It was very helpful in doing that. Deal number 1 and deal number 2 and deal number 3 were each $100. Each of those was a $100 capital contribution to the fund from the one investor and was invested in 3 different companies. What happened to those 3 deals? Deal number 1 was a big win. It was sold at 10x, $1,000. The GP took $100 investment, turned it into $1,000. What about deal number 2? Not so lucky. Deal number 2 was a write-off. Took $100, turned it into $0. Deal number 3 was $100, and it's just unrealized. It's still chugging along. Maybe it's held at cost. Maybe there's some markdown. Maybe there's a markup, but it's still moving along. Okay? So that's $300 that we called from this investor for deals, 3 different deals. And then we called $300 for expenses, organizational expenses, management fees, anything else. So this investor contributed how much money? $600. $300 for deals, 3 different deals, and $300 for expenses. Take the European waterfall. in this example, we have $1,000 to distribute. For simplicity, let's assume the GP didn't put any money in. Okay? Let's say there's one investor, the one investor put all $600 into the fund. Let's say a year goes by and we have $1,000 to distribute. How does this money go out between the investor and the GP? So look at this waterfall here, the European waterfall. Step one, return every dollar. How much did we call from this investor? $600. How much must be returned to this investor? $600. How much money is left over from this $1,000 after we return the 600? Even a lawyer can do that math. Even this lawyer can do that math, and I'm really bad at math. 1,000 minus 600 equals 400. That split 80-20. Classic. I shouldn't use the word classics to get me into trouble later because we're talking about classic American waterfalls. Conventional European venture VC waterfall. European. Return all capital in step one. So in our case, return $600. 80-20 split. No preferred return, no catch up, 80-20 split. So in our case, $600 is returned to the investor. $400 is profit. Split 80-20. $320 would go to the investor. $80 would go to the GP. And at the end of the day, you have the total split. $920 of this 1,000 went to the investor and $80 went to the GP. That's the European waterfall. And what we just described, in my experience, is the vast majority of venture capital waterfalls. I love it, as does everyone, because you can't get more straightforward, precise, and clear. That's the VC waterfall most times. Okay? We have some clients, even in venture, who have American waterfalls. Now, most venture funds still do not have preferred returns in the US. So we're not talking about pref. That's the bottom half of the chart. That's the European waterfall. $600 is returned because $600 was called, and then everything else is split 80-20. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Let's talk about the classic American waterfall. As I said, most VCs don't have American waterfalls, or certainly classic American waterfalls, but some do. And how does their waterfall then differ from the majority, at least in my experience, that have the European LP-friendly waterfall? So here's how the classic American waterfall works. Whereas the European waterfall in the first step returns every dollar, if you can see my cursor here, return every dollar. The classic American waterfall does not return every dollar in the first step. What does it return? It returns dispositions. It returns dollars that were invested in companies that were disposed of, that were sold and exited. It also returns dollars that were invested in companies that were written off. And it returns some of the expenses that the investor contributed. Yes, so let's take the same example that we walked through for the European waterfall, and let's break it down in the context of a classic American waterfall so we could see in high definition how these numbers shake out differently. If you take our example, remember our example, there was one LP, the GP made 0 contributions, all the money was contributed by the one investor, and the investor contributed, remember, $600.
Yep.
300 for 3 different deals, 100, 100, 100. The first 100 is now generating this $1,000 distribution. The second 100 was written off to 0. The third 100 is just moving along, held at cost or markup or write down, but it's still held and it's not a write-off and it's not disposed of. And then the second 300 of the 600 was contributed for fees and expenses. Let's take that example again, walk it through a classic American waterfall. This is the GP-friendly waterfall. What have been disposed of? How much was contributed for deals that were disposed of in our example? $100. Deal number 1 was sold. How much was invested in deal number 1? $100. So how much must be returned to the investor so far?
$100.
$100. Let's continue. How much was contributed by this investor that was written off? Deal number 2 is written off. Deal number 2 is written off. That's another $100. So I have to return the $100 for the deal that was disposed of. I have to return the $100 for the deal that was written off, and then I stop. Because the third deal, that third $100 contribution was not disposed of and was not written off. So of the $300 that was contributed for investment, how much must I return in the classic American waterfall? Of the $300, I have to return 2/3 of it, $200. Why? Because again, $100 was invested in a deal that was sold, and $100 was invested in a deal that was written off, and that's it. The third $100 was not disposed of. The deal was not disposed of nor written off. So I do not have to return that yet. So of the $300 that I called for my investor for investments, I have to return 200 of the 300, 2/3.
Sure.
What about the expenses? I called $300 for expenses. How much of that do I have to return? Well, I have to return 2/3 of the dollars that were contributed for deals. So guess what? I have to return 2/3 of the dollars that were not invested, but that were used for expenses and fees.
Interesting.
So I end up returning here $400. Why? Because add these 3 things up. Return dispositions, that's $100 for deal number 1. Write-offs, $100 for deal number 2. And pro rata share of your expenses. The same proportion of your called dollars that were invested that are returned, you also return that same percentage of your fund expense contributions. So 2/3. So 2/3 of the 300 deal contributions need to be returned. 2/3 of the $300 fees and expenses need to be returned. That's $400 need to be returned. Even I can do $1,000 minus $400. That's what's left over. $600 needs to be split 80-20 in the second step of the waterfall. And that's 480 to 120. So at the end of the day, whereas the European waterfall returned a total of $920 to the investor and $80 to the GP, wow, look at this. The classic Americans returning $880 to the investor and $120 to the GP.
Yeah.
Let me pause there. Is this all clear?
It is very clear, but then don't kill me for jumping the gun here. But what happens in this case if all my investments after this they fail? They are written off.
Aha! That's where we get to a clawback. Remember that thing, it's not in the waterfall. It's more in the dissolution section of a fund agreement, where it says if the fund winds down and the GP has taken too much carry, we have to give it back. And what you're zeroing in on quite rightly is that in a classic American waterfall, the risk of a clawback situation is elevated. Why? Because as you pointed out, Rakesh, where the GP is taking money sooner and not returning all the capital before the GP gets profits, as is the case here, we called $600 from the investor, but we only returned $400 and now we're already getting carry.
Yeah.
If we end up losing deal 3, for sure, you're right, there's a clawback here. But what the clawback would do is it says that you rerun the waterfall in hindsight. And if the GP took more than 20% of the total profits, the GP has to give back that excess. So if the GP got more than 20, like in this case, now my math skills are gonna get me in trouble. But in the European waterfall, the GP literally got 20% of the profits, right? $80 is literally 20% of the of the profit after of the $400 profit.
Yeah.
If the classic American Waterfall fund made this distribution and then went bust, the GP would have to give back $40 so that you get to the same 920 to 80 ratio that you had in the European waterfall.
So basically, the extent of clawback is to maintain the balance of that 80-20 split or whatever 70-30 that has been agreed between the two parties.
Exactly right. So you can add to this discussion here that in our case, where the GP got $120, at the end of the day, it really should have only gotten 80, right? If that last deal doesn't go anywhere. And so we'd have to give it back $40. Now the issue is, but I already paid taxes on that as the GP. How do I give $40 back if I'm worse off? So that's another discussion. But that's the difference between the European waterfall, very investor friendly, and the classic American waterfall, very GP friendly.
With a little higher risk of clawback.
Exactly, because every American waterfall is going to have a higher risk of clawback. What's in the middle? What's the compromise? What's a compromise approach? You have a client, or you have a VC, or you are a VC. They don't want to wait for their carry. They're comfortable taking the clawback risk. So, and they'd rather have the money in their pocket sooner. And if there is a clawback, okay, I'd rather have the money today and have to give it back to you later than never have the money at all. So I want an American waterfall. But I don't think I could raise this money with an American waterfall. The LPs will beat me up. Or maybe I went out to the market with the classic American waterfall and the LPs did beat me up. But I stood my ground and I didn't move all the way back to a European waterfall. What's the middle ground? The middle ground is what we have on the right side of the screen here, the modified American waterfall. How is a modified American waterfall different than the classic American waterfall? What makes a modified American waterfall a little bit more like a European waterfall than the classic American waterfall? The deals are all the same. The deal dollars are treated the same in both classic and modified American waterfalls. So in our one example, $300 was called for deals. Remember, deal 1, deal 2, and deal 3. Deal 1 was sold for $1,000. Deal 2 is written off to 0, and deal 3 is still being held. Just like the classic American waterfall, the modified American waterfall returns dispositions and write-offs. How much of the $300 that has been called for investment must be returned in the modified American waterfall? Exactly the same as what we had to return in the classic American waterfall. 2/3. Why? For exactly the same reason. There were 3 deals of $100. The first one was disposed of. That $100 needs to be returned, therefore. The second deal was written off. That needs to be returned, therefore. The third deal is still humming along. It does not need to be returned. So you need to return $200 of the $300 that have been called for investments. If I stop here, there's no difference between the classic and the modified American waterfall. Let's go one step further to unearth the difference. What about that second $300 that I called for my investor? The one for expenses and fees. How much of that second $300 needs to be returned in the first step of the waterfall? Well, in the classic American waterfall, we only had to return 2/3, right? The same proportion of those dollars that we returned of the invested dollars, 2/3. But in the modified American waterfall, we treat fees and expenses the same way we treated them in the European waterfall. And we have to return every dollar. So in the modified American waterfall, we're returning 300 of the $300 that we've called from our investor for expenses and fees. 200 of the 300 must be returned for the deal dollars, and 300 of the 300 for the fees and expenses. That gives you $500. So $500 must be returned to the investor in step 1 of the modified American waterfall. This is the easiest math. 1,000 minus 500 is 500. So there's $500 now of profit that I split 80-20. That's 400, 100. 400 to the LP, 100 to the GP. And at the end of the day, the GP of this $1,000 took $100 and the LP took $900. There is a clawback. There is a clawback risk because really I should have taken $80 and I took 100. So there is a clawback risk, but that's par for the course. Most GPs, given the chance, I think, would opt to take that clawback risk if it means they get dollars in their pocket sooner. I'll worry about the clawback later. There's a less clawback risk than in the classic American, because look, in the classic American, I should have taken 80, I took 120. In the modified, I should have taken 80, I took 100. So there's still a clawback risk, but it's a lower clawback risk because I've taken less profit in advance. Those are the three paradigms of the waterfall. Again, there's nuances, and there's a lot of nuances that we did not delve into because it's beyond the scope. But this I think is Distribution Waterfall 101. Okay, the top half of the chart here is a two-step waterfall where there's some level of return in capital, whether it's a European return of capital or a classic American return of capital or a modified American return of capital, and then straight to an 80-20 split. That's all common in venture. Sometimes in venture, there is a preferred return, and not in my experience very often at all. I think in Europe, it's a little more common than it is in the US. But certainly, private equity or real estate private equity or credit or fund of funds, really everything outside of venture, often will have a preferred return. And what that means is that after the first, it's not that there is two steps in the waterfall, not return of some amount of capital, either all or something less than all, and then 80-20 split, but there's three or more likely four steps. It's the same first step and the same last step. It's return some level of capital and 80-20 split, but then we introduce two middle steps. The two middle steps are preferred return and catch up. So let's explain what these are before we look at the numbers. Investor gets money back. Let's say it gets all of its money back, a European waterfall, the simplest waterfall. You get all your money back. Do I jump straight now to 80-20 of the profit? Or should it be like the LP says, look, I'm glad you made profit, but before you slice off 20% of my profit, I need to have some profit. Like, don't return exactly the dollars that you called for me. And from the very next dollar of profit, you get 20 cents. No. First, show me that you've made me some real profits, then take 20% of the profits on top of that. Let's look at our example. Same example. One LP contributed $1,000 to a fund for $600 to a fund for 3 deals of $100 each and $300 for fees and expenses. Let's just look over here. You have $1,000 to distribute. European waterfall, you return $600 because that's what we called from the investor. Now there's $400 left to return. If 1 year has gone by and we have an 8% preferred return, I got to return 8% of that $600 that I called to the investor, $48, before I take my carry. But if we stop right there and I return $600 to the investor to return this capital, plus $48 to the investor for an 8% preferred return, assuming 1 year went by, and then I take 20% of what's in excess of the 648, at the end of the day, I, the GP, am never getting 20% of the profits. I'm only getting 20% of the profits after leaking out $48 of profit. Because the $48 preferred return is profit.
Yeah.
If I give that to my investor and then I only take 20% of the excess profit above the pref, then at the end of the day, I'm never getting 20% of the profit from $1. Now you can say, who says you're entitled to 20% of the profit from $1? Totally fair. In many SPVs, for example, you won't, even if there is a preferred return, you won't necessarily have the catch up. This is purely a commercial question. How much profit should the GP getting? And maybe the deal is that the GP only gets 20% of the profit after the preferred return. But in a venture capital fund, if there is a preferred return, which again is very unusual, but in any other private fund, private equity, real estate, credit, fund of funds, where there often is, more often than not, a preferred return, in that scenario, typically, the business deal is the GP is entitled to 20% of the profits from $1 of profit. But there's a pause. You don't get it right away. You first have to give 8% to the investors in profit, and then you share in 20% of the profit, but from $1. And that's what the catch-up does. Mm-hmm. Look at our example. There was $600 that we returned to the investor over here. 1 year went by, so we owe them 8% of that. That was another $48. But then the GP gets a catch-up of $12. Because when you add up 48 and 12, that's 60.
Right.
12 is 20% of 60. So if you let's say a fund generates $660 of capital, called 600, generated 660. Okay, let's say that's a case. Let's say that's a case we're dealing with. The $600 would return the investor's money in the first step, a European waterfall. Then 48 to the investor for its preferred return. Then 12 for the GP as his catch-up. Let's say there's no more money to distribute. Spigot runs dry. How much profit was distributed? $60. How was it split between the GP and the LP? 80-20. So what the catch-up does is gives the GP the benefit of its bargain. It gives the GP 20% of the profits from $1 of the profit. Again, it doesn't have to be that way. You can have a waterfall that pays a preferred return, does not pay a catch up to the GP, and after the LP's gotten its $48 in our example, you go straight to 80-20 split for everything else. But in that case, the GP will never have gotten 20% of the profit from $1. It only got 20% of the profit from $49, right? After the pref was paid to the investor. So what the catch-up does, exactly what its name says, it catches up the general partner to give it the 20% of the profit from and including the profit that was already distributed, i.e. the preferred return.
Sure.
That's why it makes no sense. You will never talk about a catch-up when there's no pref. It doesn't. It just doesn't make sense. It's an oxymoron. Now we're already basically through our European waterfall in a private equity fund, right? Or a venture fund that has a private equity fund waterfall for some reason. You return $600 to the investor. Step one, return every dollar. You return $48 because that's 8% of the 600 after 1 year. And I say 1 year because if the $600 were outstanding for more than 1 year, the 8% compounds typically and it gets to a bigger number. But just take easy numbers. 1 year, no compounding, 8% is $48. Then the GP would get 12%, $12. So at that point in time, after the GP's gotten $12, the GP has then received 20% of total profits. And then the rest is split 80-20. And that's 272 and 68. You come out to 920 and 80. $920. Yeah.
If I may ask here, is the waterfall determined at the fund level when you are making it or forming it? Or can you have two different models as an agreement between two different LPs and the GP?
Meaning, can you have two investors in your fund that have two different waterfalls?
That's correct. So one LP, I have a European waterfall. The second LP, I have American waterfall.
You can. It's unusual. You can. Now, your fund agreement will have one or the other. Your fund agreement is not going to have two different waterfalls in it for two different investors.
Correct.
Your LPA will have one waterfall, but you can, in a side letter, change the waterfall for one of your LPs. So to say, basically, ignore the waterfall in the LPA. For you, this is how the waterfall is going to work.
So unusual, but it can happen.
Could happen.
Okay.
More often in side letters like that, you'll have tweaks to the waterfall, like you'll have a higher preferred return or a lower preferred return or a higher carry or a lower carry or a faster catch up or a slower catch up. Those are more often the types of editing to the waterfall that you'll do in a side letter. But I've definitely seen examples like you're saying where the LPs, I want a different waterfall altogether. Okay, we'll address it in a side letter. This is possible.
Sure.
I want to point out something so interesting that it jumps off the page when you look at this, or maybe it doesn't, but I wanted to. So I'm going to point it out. We're not moving to the classic or the modified waterfalls yet. Just look at the European waterfall. At the end of the day, look at the total split on the top half of the page and look at the total split at the bottom half of the page. Do you see any difference? You don't. It's 920 to 80. In the case where we generate $1,000 on the $600 that was contributed, 300 for expenses, 300 for 3 deals, the money goes out exactly the same way.
Just the timing of the day.
Exactly. And that's to illustrate, I think what that really illustrates is what the preferred return and catch up are actually doing. And the answer is they're not doing anything. Assuming there's enough profit, right? Assuming there's enough profit to get through the preferred return step and to get through the catch up step, they're not doing anything. Because all they are is a timing element. I think of the pref as a pause button. It's not supposed to change the ultimate split between the LP and the GP as long as the fund is profitable enough.
Yeah.
If you have $1,000 to distribute, like in our example, whether there's a preferred return or not, it's still going to be 920 to 80. It's still going to be return all capital and then 80-20 split.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the ultimate the returns do not change, but as you said earlier, it's always preferred by the GP to get the returns as soon as they can, even if it comes at the risk of the clawback. So basically, if you are a guy who's doing the math around, depending on the numbers on the TVM, the time value of the money, right? Then you would say, okay, give me. I would get the bigger money earlier. That the TVM gives me a better return.
Right. That's right. Now between in column C here, right? They're both European waterfalls. One has a preferred return and a catch up, and one doesn't. The numbers come out exactly identical.
Correct.
Let's move to the middle. Let's move to the middle column here, the classic American waterfall, with 4 steps in your waterfall and not 2. So you had the same case, right? $600 contributed. 300 for 3 different deals, one of which was disposed of for 1,000, one was written off to 0, one is held, and $300 for fees and expenses. You have $1,000 now to distribute from that first exit that you had. Mm-hmm. Again, same as the classic American waterfall with 2 steps. The first step isn't changing. You return 400 of the $1,000 to your investor. Why? $100 to return deal 1, which was $100 and sold. $100 to return deal number 2, which was $100 and written off. That's 2 of the $300 of the deal dollars were returned. And now the same proportion, 2/3 of the fees and expenses, 2 of the $300 there. So that's 200 plus 200 is 400 is returned in the first step. Now what do? We have a preferred return of 8%. The preferred return accrues on whatever was required to be returned. So that's $32. $32 is 8% of 400. So I return $32. Then I need a catch up. So the GP's got 20% of the dollars of profit from $1 of profit. That's $8. Then we split the rest 80-20, and you get the end result is $880 of the 1,000 were distributed to the investor, and 120 were distributed to the GP. Look at the two-step waterfall. Is there any difference? There is no difference. 880 to 120 with the pref and the catch-up, or without the pref and the catch-up. Exactly the same as we said in the European waterfall. The pref and catch-up are a timing element, not an
Yeah.
ultimate dollars element, assuming the same returns for the two funds, right?
Yeah.
Assuming there's enough money to get through the pref and the catch-up, they'll work out the same way. Modified American waterfall, again, the only difference is in step one. And the modified American waterfall, whether there is a pref and or catch up or not, that doesn't, the pref is step two. The catch up is step three. Step one doesn't change. Whether there is or is not a step two, it doesn't change step one. Whether is or is not step three, it doesn't change step one. So when your modified American waterfall, again, same example, you have $600 contributed, 300 for deals, one of which was disposed of for 1,000, one of which was written off to zero, one of which is held. $300 were contributed for fees and expenses. You have that $1,000 to return. Of that $1,000, you're returning half of it, 500, in the step one of the waterfall in the modified American. Why? Because for the deals, the modified American waterfall is treated the same as the classic American waterfall. You're returning only two of the $300, right? The $100 that was disposed of for the deal that was sold, the $100 for the deal was written off, but that third $100 you don't have to return yet because that's being held unrealized. But then the expenses and fees are treated in a modified American like a European waterfall.
European.
So you have to turn all three of that. So we return 200 plus 300, $500. What's your preferred return on the $500? 8% is 40. Then we have a GP catch up to give the GP 20% of the profits from $1 of profit. That's $10. And the rest is split 80-20. What do you get at the end? 90 for the 900 for the investor, 100 for the GP. What did we have in the two-step waterfall? Modified American, exactly the same thing. $900 for the investor, $100 for the GP, because the pref and the catch-up are just about timing, not about actual dollars. Those are the three waterfalls.
But in a hypothetical scenario, if I may bring up, so you have done the distributions until that last T that you're still holding up. You have distributed whatever potentially could be distributed, right? And then there is an unforeseen expense which comes up, right? Say a lawsuit or something else.
Right.
Where does that come from? Who gets exposed to that? Who absorbs that?
Well, the fund would call capital for it, right?
Okay.
And then it would
But
be in a clawback
if
situation.
all the commitment is already kind of contributed by the LP, what happens then?
If the fund has a liability, that has a couple of things it could do. So number one, it would call dry powder if there is any. If you're saying there is none, there was only $600 committed to this fund, and all $600 was contributed to the fund. There's nothing left. So then there's nothing to call from the investor. So then where would we get the money from? If we have proceeds from deal 3, right? We dispose of deal 3, or we sell deal 3 to generate proceeds of deal 3. We can use those monies. And then very often in funds, you will have two things additionally that you can do. Most funds have a recycling provision, which says, look, we return to you 600, 648, 900, 920, whatever. We return all this money to you. We called all your commitments of 600, but then we return money to you. We can recycle those distributions. We can call back some amount. And there are different ways to do it with different limitations and different timing and amount limitations potentially. But we can call back to recycle, whether for new investments potentially, or certainly for expenses. So recycling is one way to generate more cash if you've depleted your dry powder. And another thing that most funds can do is have what we call a partner give back, which is similar to recycling, but recycling permits reinvestment, and a partner give back allows the GP under certain circumstances with certain limitations to say, shucks, I made a distribution. I regret doing it because now I have this liability. Hey, everyone put their money back in. Pretend I never made the distribution, which means if the GP took its carried interest, it got to return that, right? Last dollar's out, first dollar's back in. So you unwind or you unzip the distribution to get more money to pay your expense.
Sure.
That also creates more of a clawback risk, right? Because I return the money that I have, and now I'm deeper in the hole, right? Because I'm calling more money from my investors. So, anyways, that's that. That's how you deal with that.
So yeah, Yoni, this makes it pretty clear. I think this, as we started on the note that this is what the ultimate goal for all the invested or all the included stakeholders is, and the way it can be structured is pretty much these three models. So thank you so much for sharing this. I'm pretty sure that this is as valuable as all the other conversations we have had in past, and our viewers are going to enjoy it and learn a lot from it. But thank you again for taking time. I appreciate that.
Pleasure, Rakesh. Thank you so much for hosting.